Okay.
Hello and welcome to episode 59 of the Chills at Will podcast. I'm here today, lucky me, with Tod Goldberg, who is the New York Times bestselling author of over a dozen books, including The Low Desert, which will be the main focus of our talk today, Gangsterland, a finalist for the Hammett Prize, Gangster Nation, The House of Secrets, which he co authored with Brad Meltzer, Living Dead Girl, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize, and the popular Burn Notice series. His books have been published in a dozen languages and around the world and were twice named finalists for the VN International Thriller of the Year Award. His short fiction has been collected in three volumes: Simplify, which won the Other Voices Book Prize and was a finalist for the SCBA Award, Other Resort Cities, and his latest book, The Low Desert Gangster Stories, and his work has been widely anthologized. His essays, journalism, and criticism have appeared in numerous publications, including the LA Times, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal, among countless other publications and anthologies, and have earned five Nevada Press Association Awards for Excellence, while his essay, When They Let Them Bleed, was selected for Best American Essays. For his body of work, Todd was honored with the Silver Pen Award from the Nevada Writers Hall of Fame. In addition to his work on the page, Todd is also the co-host of the podcast Literary Disco, along with Julia Pisto and Ryder Strong, which has been named a top podcast by the Washington Post, The Guardian, Mashable, and even Good Housekeeping, among others. He is also the co-host, along with essayist Maggie Downs, of Open Book on KCOD Coachella FM, the leading public radio station in the Coachella Valley. Tod Goldberg holds an MFA in creative writing and literature from Bennington College and is a professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, where he directs the low residency MFA program in creative writing and writing for the performing arts. He lives in Indio, California with his wife, the beauty writer Wendy Duran. Sir, thank you so much for joining me. How are you doing today?
Shit. After you read that, I'm doing great. I sound pretty goddamn impressive.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have today. So I'll talk to.
Wow. I don't know how I have time to do all my modeling, and
On the side, huh? Oh
yeah,
my
it's
gosh.
quite surprising. And my professional athletic ability was
Right.
not even mentioned. The years I spent as a first baseman for the Oakland A's.
So which one is the side hustle, right? Geez, man. Uh,
Well, the podcasting, as you know, pays extraordinarily well.
oh yes, oh yes. Well, no, all jokes aside, thanks so much for joining me. I'm swimming in the low desert, having just read it recently, and the writing is just incredible. And congratulations, first of all, on publishing a book in the midst of the pandemic.
Thank you. It feels pretty good. And the nice thing about the book coming out now is uh I've gotten a chance to do more stuff than I normally would have. This is
Hmm.
this is sort of the weird plus side of the pandemic. Normally, I'd travel around for a couple of weeks. I'd wake up in a Courtyard Inn in Spokane with a yesterday's cheeseburger on the bed, and I'd fly home with stories of my valor. But now, I'm doing stuff every single day, basically, and I'm really getting out and seeing a lot of people from the comfort of my own home. So there are some pluses to this, but man, I'm fully vaccinated right now, and I am ready to hit the road.
I I hear you. I just kind of wondering out loud, and you know much better than I would. Like, well, maybe nobody knows. Like, what's it going to be like? I've heard a lot of writers talk about, the old fashioned book tour is gone. Some people say modified. Do you feel like you'll be taking some of what you've learned here and kind of
Oh,
becoming
for
like a
sure.
hybrid? Yeah.
For sure. What I think what the publishers have found out certainly is that if you can get 300 or 500 people for an online event, there's no good reason to fly you,
Hmm.
across the country, put you up in a hotel and spend, $2,000 for 50 people to show up somewhere.
Right.
So, I suspect in the future that book tours and book events, you're going to see a lot of a little bit of each.
Hmm.
There's a real desire, of course, to go out there and shake the hands and sign the books and all of that. But people are so comfortable now having this kind of Zoom experience. I don't think that's going to go away. And the nice thing too is that if you're doing it and someone's doing a really long poetry reading or something, you can get up and leave and they don't know.
Hmm. Right. Yes. I'd love to delve into a little bit about how you grew up. You grew up in a family of writers. You know,
Yes.
what were you reading? Was there something? Was there some sort of rebellion in you when you're younger? Like, hey, this is the way it is in the family. I'm gonna do something different. Or were you always like, you know what? I'm gonna read. Excuse me. I'm gonna write. And I also kind of wonder what those influences were. You know, from whom, from which books, etc.
Right. My rebellion was never about the reading or the writing. My rebellion briefly was I had like a 2-year period where I was kind of goth, but then we moved to the desert from Northern California, and it's impossible to be goth when it's 115 degrees outside. Like,
Yes. Yes.
just pastels are a better way to live your life. It was strange. Reading and writing has always been a big part of my life, but also my family's life. My mom was a journalist. My dad was a TV news journalist. My grandmother on my mother's side was a journalist, long before I was born. So, and even just, in general, as Jews, reading and writing has always been, I think, part of cultural Judaism,
Hmm.
a real appreciation for it, at least. So, it was always encouraged in my family that I should read and that I should write. That was always a part of it. But as I've said many times over in different places, I was profoundly dyslexic as a child. And so I didn't learn to read until I was about 10 years old. And then once I was able to read, it was like an avalanche.
Hmm.
I started to read everything at once, basically. Um, and right around that same time that I learned to read, my brother went off to college, and my brother Lee, who's also a novelist, and he left me a bunch of bags of books, and in those bags of books was like the history of American noir. So
Uh-huh.
it was like John McDonald and Jim Thompson and old Elmore Leonard and Donald Westlake and Lawrence Block, but then also like Mac Bolan and The Destroyer and books like that as well.
Huh.
So as soon as I was able to read, I really latched on to genre fiction very early. Also because I think it was easier, frankly. Like
Okay.
those 70s men's action adventure novels. They were 150 pages long. They weren't exactly written in florid prose. Like even a 10 or 11-year-old could grasp the style pretty quickly. Like Hemingway thought they were minimalists. Um, and so diving into crime fiction from a very early age, that was something that was encouraged in my family for sure. um, but as I grew older, I started to get different influences. By the time I was in college, I really was into sort of the dirty realist period of American
Hmm.
short fiction. The Richard Fords and the Tim O'Briens, to a lesser extent Raymond Carver, but then also writers like Amy Hempel and Susan Straight and Margaret Atwood. And
Okay.
um, you know, I was getting a ton of great influences just even as an undergraduate in college that for sure was influencing the things that I was writing.
Very interesting. I wonder, the idea of the chills of will. The name of the podcast is this idea of those lines, those paragraphs, those excerpts, those pieces that you almost like memorize. That there's just right there at the tip of your tongue. I wonder if there's anything that stood out to you, a poem, a short story, a piece that is one you could almost like memorize, even for today.
Oh yeah, Raymond Chandler, Maltese Falcon, um,
Mm.
or not Raymond Chandler. I'm sorry, Dashiell Hammett, Maltese Falcon. When Sam Spade is talking to the woman whose name escapes me, and she's basically asking Sam Spade to let her off the hook for the killing of his partner, and he says, being a detective, uh, it's like a dog chasing a rabbit. Sometimes he might let that rabbit go, but it's not within his nature.
Hmm.
I'm parafrasing, but it's about it. But that is the statement of noir fiction and the private
Uh-huh.
detective. It's like a dog with a bone or a dog chasing a rabbit. Sometimes you might let that rabbit go, but it's not within your nature.
That's cool.
And that's I think about that a lot.
Hmm.
Um, and I think about poems like "Diving into the Wreck" by Adrian Rich. Like that poem had a
Mm.
fundamental effect on me.
Sure.
Or I think about "The Conquered Hymn" by Ralph Waldo Emerson, because in 8th grade, Mr. Dunbar made us memorize it, even though none of us wanted to. And so right now, if you'd like, I could tell you a good portion of the Conquered Hymn by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Are you ready?
The floor is yours.
Here we go. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flags to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Like foes long since in silence slept, alike the conqueror's silence sleeps. In time the ruined bridge is swept down the stream which seaward creeps.
Wow.
There's one more verse. I can never remember it. It's about today we place a vote of stone, but that part's lost. I remember the first two very well.
Unless you have some crazy system of teleprompters, you know, look, because you were looking up and to the side, like you did not remember. I mean, that was not a teleprompter. That was off the top of the head. Congratulations.
That was off the top of the head.
Wow.
And the funny thing is, anyone who went to school in Walnut Creek, California,
yes,
and took Mr. Dunbar's class, you can say to them, give me the Conquered Hymn, and it's just like, by the rude bridge arch to flood, their flags April's breeze unfurled.
Oh my gosh. I am speaking to you from Sacramento. My family almost moved to Pleasanton or Walnut Creek at one time, so I know the area.
Yes, this is at Foothill Middle School,
okay.
Mr. Dunbar's history class. And I remember that poem better than I remember all of my years studying the Transcendentalists that Ralph Waldo Emerson was part of.
Sure. So, you know, especially because of the writing, the type of writing that you do, I feel like all writers in some way, or many writers, you know, they see a narrative, they put things in narrative automatically, right? And so I wonder if, like, even from a young age, with your incredible story about dyslexia and overcoming that, did you like see yourself as a character in a book or a movie or like a text?
You know, I had some weird disassociative stuff when I was a kid. You know, I wrote a short story years ago called Simplify about some of the stuff that I did. You know, I had a weird relationship with language and with words and with letters. And part of my dealing with the dyslexia was compensating, just like anyone compensates with any disability, right? And so I would assign, I guess it's sort of like a kind of aphasia, really. I would assign words or meaning to a letter. And so that way I would sort of mnemonically know that Q should look like this and should sound like this.
Wow.
So, you know, my brain was doing some kind of work there because it wasn't doing the normal work. And then once I got trained out of the dyslexia, all of that just sort of disappeared. And I can only remember bits and pieces of it that I'd used in that story that I wrote. I wrote the story 30 years ago at this point, my God, 25, 30 years ago. But, you know, I used some of my memory of that stuff. But, you know, the thing about the dyslexia is I think it taught me the relationship between words and sounds in a way that perhaps sort of poets look at stuff. And so I'm always really interested in the way things are working together on the page, not just to have the factual data, but so that the rhythm and the sound is the way I want it to be. And this is important in sort of the kind of noir stuff that I write, where voice plays a really significant role in it.
Sure. So, I mean, are you reading your work aloud a lot as you go, or at the very end? Is that a big part of your writing process?
No. But you know, the problem is now is I have a guy who does the audiobooks, Johnny Heller. And now whenever I read my own work, I hear it in Johnny Heller's voice. He does a really good job. He's read my last 4 books.
Oh, man.
And I just, so now when I'm writing, I'm like, oh gosh, I hope Johnny likes this. And when he was recording The Low Desert, I was like, oh, I can't wait to hear how you do this story. And he's like, well, you know, don't be concerned. I was like, no, like sometimes when I'm writing this stuff, I can sort of hear your voice in my head. Like, how's he going to portray the clown? You know, all this stuff.
I actually look forward to hearing the clown. Who's, you know, a big part of him was his lack of voice. That's very interesting, right? How did you, you know, I don't know if there was one eureka moment or eureka moments, but how did you figure out like, hey, I want to do this for a living, and also like I'm good at this. People read my work and like it.
Yeah, well, you know, the benefit of growing up in a family of writers is that it always seemed possible. and plausible. And I don't think for most people that want to be a professional writer that either of those two things seem remotely,
Sure.
in the wheelhouse, right? But when I decided that I wanted to be a writer, I mean, I guess I always knew I've been writing stories from a very young age. Um, but when I was in college, I had a brief period of time where I flirted with the idea of wanting to be a lawyer or work in public relations or work in advertising. And then after college, I got a job working in advertising, and I was like, I want to kill myself, and I want to kill every single person in this building. And so I knew that was not going to be a good long-term goal for me. But it might also be because I was working in for a company that made infomercials, amongst other things, and that's a whole other animal. It was an infomercial company that was owned by a cult, but I'm going to save that for when I write about it.
I was going to say that needs to be written. Wow.
Yeah, I might use that for something else. So when did I know I was good at it? Pretty early.
Yeah.
I mean, not to be more filled with myself than I normally am, but I knew even in like 8th grade that I was a better writer than the other people in the room. And then in high school, I had a wonderful teacher named Mrs. Kane, or Miss Kane. She was my high school English teacher junior and senior year. And she pulled me aside one day in my junior year. She was very tough. People really disliked her because she was so hard. But I liked her because I could make her laugh. And there's always something that like, oh, I'm going to make that hard person to laugh, that victory feeling. And so I think she began to like me. And then I realized that she was hard because she expected a lot from her students. But at any rate, she pulled me aside one day in my junior year of high school, and she said, "Look, you're a really good writer. You know more about The Great Gatsby than I do. Like, you don't need to write any more book reports on The Great Gatsby or, Ivanhoe. Like, it's useless for you. You know this stuff." And she said, "Here's what I want you to do. Every time I tell the class to write a book report, I want you to write me a short story based on something in the book."
What a cool assignment.
And I was like, "Oh my gosh, that's an amazing assignment." She's like, "Don't tell anyone else, because if you tell anyone else, you gotta go back to writing book reports." But she's like, just you write me a story every single time. And basically we did that for 2 years, where I wrote her a story for every single book report. And she would give me notes and give back to me. And I mean, it was a gift, of course. And at the same time, of course, my brother at that point was already a successful television writer and novelist as well. Lee's 9 years older than me. And by the time I was 18, I think he was already working on Spencer for Hire, the TV show, based on the Robert Parker books. So, I was showing Lee my work. I was showing my sisters my work. And, it became pretty obvious that I knew what I was doing. And then it wasn't, when I decided this is what I want to do, I took some classes at UCLA Extension in the evenings when I was still working in advertising, and I was better than everyone there. And I just started to send my work out, and I began to get published very quickly.
Yeah. On one of the interviews I was listening to, one of the podcasts, you kind of downplayed your first book, which is, I'm sure, a lot better than you'd said it was. You're kind of like, well. But your second, your second novel was a finalist for the 2003 LA Times Book Prize, like for Best Mystery. It was January Magazine's top novels in 2002. You had arrived, right?
Well, you'd think that, but the truth of the matter is, so my first book was a novel called Fake Liar Cheat, and it was not very good. The reviews are correct, but I sold it to Miramax for a film that they were going to make with Cameron Diaz, that they, of course, never made, or else you'd know about it. And then I wrote Living Dead Girl directly after that, because I wanted to write a good book at that point. And Living Dead Girl, for all of its critical acclaim, was a sales loser. Like, no one bought that book. No one wanted to read a really sad book at that time. It came out right after 9/11.
Sure.
And no one wanted to. So 9/11 was in September of 2001. Living Dead Girl came out in May of 2002, I think it was.
Oh boy.
and no one wanted to read a sad novel about, a guy who may or may not have killed his wife and child. And so it got good reviews, but it sold really poorly. And it was hard to figure out what to do next after that. But to the outside world, absolutely, I had arrived in high style.
Yeah. It's a good transition into a good connection to like I think of Mario Puzo, right? He wrote The Fortunate Pilgrim, I believe was he believed was his best book. It was the most critically acclaimed. He wrote The Godfather, of course, and people said to him, like, hey, you had to have either been in the mob or known people in the mob, right? Like you had to.
Right.
Like, now, there's a great example of a book that was critically acclaimed and also was commercially successful. Your books are critically acclaimed and commercially successful. They're really well done. They're art as well as commerce. But back to Puzo, he said, no, I just did research. You write about some very horrible, terrible, traumatic events, people. You seem to be a really good guy, though. Is this like the id, or And I guess how do you tap into the underworld, the grossness of life, the evils of life?
Well, I'm always interested in man's capacity for violence. Violence has always compelled me. I've always been interested in it from a very, very young age. You had mentioned earlier an essay of mine, When They Let Them Bleed, which was in Best American Essays. And that essay is about being about 10 years old and seeing the boxer Duke Koo Kim get killed in the ring when he was fighting Ray Boom Boom Mancini. And watching that as a 10-year-old, the violence that it took to kill a man in a ring, I probably had PTSD from it, in thinking about it now as sort of an irrational response, because I could not stop thinking about it. I was obsessed by this guy getting killed in the ring for years afterwards. And there I was, just like millions of other people, watching it for sport. Like, this is a guy who died for my entertainment, essentially. And those are the sorts of things that I think about as it relates to the kinds of people that I write about. People's capacity for violence, people's capacity to be entertained by violence, and people's capacity to resort to violence when they have no other choices, or that they perceive themselves to have no other choices. I'm fascinated by that. And so I've done a lot of research into it, but I also just know a lot of terrible people and have talked to them. And, growing up in the desert in Palm Springs specifically, so I spent up through essentially my freshman year of high school in the Bay Area in Walnut Creek. And then I went to high school in Palm Springs. But I've been coming to Palm Springs my entire life. My grandparents had homes here starting in the 1950s, because it was the only place where Jews could come to play golf. And they were from the Pacific Northwest. So the thing about Palm Springs that people don't typically know that much about is that it was built, as much as Las Vegas was, by the mob. Palm Springs is an open city. And so the mob came and vacationed here, and all those nightclubs and steakhouses and golf courses that popped up in the 1950s, and gambling halls and places Frank Sinatra hung out. He wasn't hanging out in those places because they were built by nice guys.
Right.
Throughout the Coachella Valley, you're not in the presence of nice guys a lot of times. And to quote a Dr. Dre song. And so even as a kid, like, I was aware of these like restaurants that would burn down every 2 years. Like, why does Paul D'Amico's burn down? Like, why is it always Paul D'Amico's? That seems weird. Why is there always a restaurant called Bobby M and Bobby M's burns down? That seems weird. And, my mom would date sort of these mid-level crime guys, guys who own suit stores and cocktail bars that no one ever went to, so like all these things were sort of floating around in the ether around me.
Sure.
And then, as we talked about earlier, from a very early age, I'd had an interest in crime fiction. So all of that combined with just sort of my dark view of the world, I think ends up with what you got here.
Well, that's interesting. You talk about like the mid-level guys, and I've heard you say before that you're really interested in the the goon number 4, like one of your stories. And
Right.
that is so true. The machinations of all this behind the scenes. It's not just the Don Corleone. It's what about Luca Brasi and those kind of
Right.
guys. In one of the blurbs for Gangsterland, Ron Curry Jr. wrote, "Let's get this part out of the way. Gangsterland is a thriller and provides a crackling good read for any fan of the genre. But the truth is, to call this book merely a thriller is inaccurate. It's also a whip-smart comedy, a sublime morality play, and a gleefully blasphemous investigation of what and why we worship." I wonder, I mean, this is about Gangsterland, which is obviously similar to the subject matter of the Low Desert. Do you feel like it's limiting to call you a crime writer or a genre writer? Because, I mean, obviously I agree there's so much about morality and faith and place and all of that in your writing. It's not just about crime.
No, I mean, I'm a crime writer, and I think the notion of what genre means has changed over the
Okay.
years. I think maybe the best book I read in the last 5 years or so is Steph Chaw's book, Your House Will Pay.
Heard great things.
Just an absolute remarkable novel about race, about culture, about the city of Los Angeles, about violence, about vengeance, about memory. Just an absolute remarkable piece of work. It's a crime novel, but so is The Great Gatsby. So is To Kill a Mockingbird. The history of American fiction is built on people with a gun doing something. Often, when you think about the great books of our times, there's almost always a criminal act inside of it. But when I was younger, I wanted to be a literary writer, but I don't even know what that means anymore. I think what it meant to me when I was younger is I wanted to be taken seriously. But what ended up happening is I ended up writing, books that weren't like what I wanted to read.
Okay.
Like I wanted to write books that were, like I wanted to write like Elmore Leonard books, or I wanted to write books that were like watching a season of The Wire. Those were the things I wanted to do, and I don't know why I didn't do that to start with, other than the fact that my ambition and my talent were not on an equal playing field at the time. But I think the best crime fiction has always held up a mirror to society and forced the reader to answer hard questions. And so when I think of sort of the text of this sort of era of crime fiction where I think you're really seeing it taken seriously, I think of a book like Mystic River by Dennis Lehane.
All right.
And that Lehane wrote that in a period of time where he was trying to figure out, like, how do I go from just writing detective novels to something bigger? And so he went from Mystic River and he wrote Shutter Island and all that stuff too, and now he makes great TV shows. He's really become a novelist who writes about important things with the background of crime. And I look at Mystic River and I'm like, man, that's a great crime novel, but it's also about neighborhoods, and it's about faith, and it's about relationships, and it's about father-daughter relationships, it's about husbands and wives, it's about the secrets that we tell the people that we love, all of it circling around a series of crimes, but specifically the murder of a young woman. And so when I started to write Gangsterland, I was like, well, shit, if Dennis Lehane can write Mystic River about the things that he wanted to write about the things that he cared about in the place where he grew up, I can write a book about things that I care about while battling with my own notions of what the Jewish faith is culturally and religiously, while also telling a badass gangster story. Like, why not?
Right.
Why not? Because if I can't do it, no one can do it.
Right.
And so I'd be sitting right here in exactly the same space that you're staring at me here on Zoom, typing my little stories out. And I'd walk out into the living room where my wife would be, and I'd be like, well, the hitman's now a rabbi. And my wife would be like, cool, that sounds great. It'd be like, I'm just gonna swing for the fences and see what happens. And it worked, thankfully.
It definitely did. I'll try to make this my last or second to last Godfather reference, but you talk about the history of America with the gun, right? The epigraph for the book is, behind every great fortune, there's a crime, right? And that's definitely true with the Cupertine family. Yeah?
Yes.
No doubt about it. But it's so cool with your short story collection that you have these repeat characters from Gangsterland, from your other works, Sal, of course, the Cupertine family, like I talked about. And there's such a cool sensation of there being a space in between with the time in between. When we come back to them, it's like, oh, cool. It's like meeting an old friend, right?
Right.
And so, there's so much going on here. You have so many cool stories. You talked about wanting to populate a universe with the characters from this
Right.
book. And it's
Right.
it's more than possible, right? There's so many interesting stories just in these 12 short stories. I thought maybe we could talk a couple of the themes of the low desert. And one is definitely place. And you talked a little bit about the Coachella Valley and Palm Springs. I also, and pardon me if I'm a little bit wrong on the geography here, but is that the most arrogant land title ever for a region, which is the Inland Empire?
Right? Well, there's a couple inland empires out there. There's an inland empire in the Pacific Northwest too, and
there is. Huh?
Yeah, and it's never anywhere that you want to be.
That's funny. That's funny. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the Salton Sea, which is so interesting. There's literally one story called The Salt, and there's, I don't know, probably at least 3 or so stories that deal with the Salton Sea. What compelled you to include that as almost like its own character, the sea itself?
Yeah, the Salton Sea is a fairly amazing place, and as an image, it works out perfectly because it's a grift. The Salton Sea isn't a real thing. In 1905, a river was allowed to jump its banks and fill an ancient salt plain that had been a body of water called Lake Kauai that swept from essentially Palm Springs all the way out into the Gulf of Mexico for thousands of years. And in fact, the mountains surrounding the Salton Sea, you can still see the water line on the mountains. It's pretty cool. So there was this ancient salt plain that was there, and in 1905 the river jumped its levees and was allowed to fill this bowl for about 2 years. Well, the fact of the matter is that the government and land prospectors and companies and grifters of all kinds have been trying to rewild this area of the Imperial Valley between Palm Springs and San Diego and Mexico since the 1800s.
Sure.
And it had always been a grift. Like, it had always been a grift. And no one had ever sat down and thought to themselves, well, if we fill an ancient salt plain with water, what's going to live in the salt water in the middle of a desert? Yeah. Like, it was there. Now, of course, scientifically, they didn't have the knowledge that we have now, but it was doomed to fail from the get-go. But it didn't stop us from letting people go out there and build and prospect and all that stuff. So in the 1950s and early 1960s, the Salton Sea was being developed by the same guy who essentially developed a lot of Palm Springs, basically a Chicago gangster. And he had built up all the nightclubs and restaurants in Palm Springs and was building the marina and was trying to get housing tracts built out with the Salton Sea. And they built the infrastructure for a city of 150,000 on the shores of the Salton Sea. But it was a grift. It was all a grift. It was always a grift. Mm-hmm. And Californians have just sort of abetted it. And now, of course, it's this gigantic ecological disaster that is it's the largest ecological disaster in America, and also the lowest point in America. So there's a lot of really cool thematic things that one can steal from that if they're a crime writer. And so I wanted to write a short story about the early era, the 1950s or the 1960s, when they were developing the Salton Sea and attempting to find oil and methane and geothermal electricity out there. And I wanted to make it a crime story. And I'd been trying to write it for a long, long time. And when I was working on this book, I decided, well, initially I was going to try to tie it all into the gangster families in Gangsterland and Gangster Nation. Then I realized, I can sort of do my own different thing with this. Mm-hmm. I can tie it in tangentially to Chicago organized crime without it being in the same crime family, which is also me realizing I needed to separate some rights out in this book and not have everything tied up by the same rights. But that's not for the listeners to probably know or care about. But anyway, So I started to write The Low Desert, and I realized as I was writing that story that there was probably a book also in that, or a TV show. There's something more to be said about that region. But if you live here in the Coachella Valley, and I live in India, which is about 35 minutes from the Salton Sea, 40 minutes, it's part of your life because you can smell it.
Uh-huh.
On a bad day, what we call Salton Sea days, you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh my God, did the dog kill something, drag it in and put it under the bed? It's just the Salton Sea. You can smell it. It just seeps into your house. There's been fewer of them lately, but when it's bad, it smells like death. And it hangs over the entire bowl of the Coachella Valley for days.
Right. Well, yeah, there's such a contrast, you've talked about, and in some of your characters, and the setting of Palm Springs, which has a lot of glitz and glamour, and then the Salton Sea, which parts of it, like you said, are like the poorest parts of America, are pretty damn
Right.
close depending on the year. And the sea as a character, right? It's decrepit. The people are starting to become decrepit. They're maverick. They're people who've chosen or have been forced to live there, and it's
Right.
and it's desolate, and it just goes so well with the book. Redemption and new beginnings. Morris is a character that really spoke to me. His wife, he's one of those. I thought it was very interesting that you made him have 3 wives throughout
Right.
the stories, and they're all pretty good. They're all pretty good marriages for the most part, right?
Until they die.
Sure, except for that thing, right? But they all gave him something different,
Right.
But I believe it was Catherine said to him, his first wife said, "You're not made up of your worst days, Morris." He's got this guilt from the Korean War. She just cannot believe, and she asked him straight up, like, how could you have killed these people in Korea, right? And so he's looking for this new beginning. He moves, correct me if I'm wrong, up to the Washington State area.
Right.
Gets a new start up there, but it's always kind of one step ahead of him thinking about all the people that he killed, giving them a face. And it sounds like he's suicidal on 2 occasions.
Correct.
But again, saved through the grace of his wives. Goon number 4 is a story, and the character's name is, I believe, Goon number 4.
Well, actually,
part, right?
his name is Blake Webster, which is important because Blake Webster is an old friend of mine that I went to high school with.
Nice.
And as I was writing the story, I couldn't think of a name to give the guy, and I was just sitting here, and I just clicked on Facebook, and Blake Webster had some update about how he'd opened up a new restaurant in Louisville, and I was like, Blake Webster, I'm going to make you famous.
So I think that you have about half of the qualities in common with him. He's a podcaster, and also a mercenary. So that's not
right.
Right. But just the fact that who seems to be, he's pretty much amoral, it seems, but he does he wants to go straight.
Right.
And so he gets into, radio broadcasting, stuff like that. Rabbi Cohen, we could do a whole episode there. That's Sal Cupertine. Am I correct?
Correct.
Right. And, he's giving out advice at times as if he really is a rabbi.
Well, this is the thing. All these years he spent becoming a fake rabbi, if he's going to be any good at it, he has to be a real rabbi.
Sure. And then even with the redemption, not to give too much away with Jacob, correct me, the name of the story is with Jacob Soboroff?
Ragtown.
Right. Where he has a lot of guilt, and rightfully so. Cowardice and the whole deal, but he's again searching for redemption.
Right.
What is it about redemption that keeps? Am I misreading that, or do you feel like there's something that you have that sort of love of, or wanting to know more about redemption? I guess if you're asking those questions.
Yeah, I think when you write about people who've done bad things, you want them at some point in the story to go through a change of some kind. Either they get worse or they try to get better. And whether or not they succeed in getting better is often the story. Or if they succeed in stopping themselves from getting worse. And so a story like Goon number 4, which, it's satire, but it's satirizing the things that I write about. Right.
Yeah, okay.
Which, it's a little meta, right?
It is meta, exactly. Layers.
I'm satirizing a badass goon who goes around and kills people and does also some funny oddball things, which is like half of the stories in this book. But I'm also sort of hanging a lantern over him and saying, okay, I'm going to show you how he's real.
Sure.
And I'm going to show you why he can exist in this world, which took a lot of work. Because so the original version of that story I wrote for an anthology that Lawrence Block asked me for a story for, which was a thrill. Like when a hero calls you and it's like, hey, I love a short story. After you stop sobbing, you then feel like, oh, I gotta come big for Lawrence Block, because without Lawrence Block, I don't have a career. And so in the anthology that appeared in for Lawrence Block, it was a lot more satirical. And then when I put it in the book, and this was like 3 months later, I was reworking it for the book. My editor and I worked very closely to try to figure out, okay, how can we keep it funny? How can we keep it satirical? But how can we make it fit next to a story like The Low Desert, where a bone serious story? How can these two stories exist in the same world? And the answer is that, I often have given you a world that seems like it could be surreal, but then I provide you some aspect that makes you realize, oh no, this is as real gets. And these are just people that happen to operate inside of it. Makes you look at different crimes and think, oh my God, some goon number 4 do that. But in terms of redemption, I feel like every book I've ever written, at some base level, is about a person struggling with their identity, about who they are versus who they think they are or who they want to be. And so even in a story like Goon number 4, when he says the only thing that really gives him joy is seeing how his dog sees the world, you're like, man, that is a heartbreaking thing to find joy in. Like the only thing that you really love is watching your dog experience the world. And when I wrote that line, I was like, oh, that's deeply fucked up, Todd. It's time to take a break from the computer. But I like that because it's a human trait that we can all believe in. And, it's a little bit of a trick, right? I want you to empathize with people you should fear or that you should abhor.
Sure.
And so I give these people jobs, duties in these stories that you can recognize. I'm going to try to be a better person. Well, my version of being a better person is I will fucking kill somebody for you.
I guess it's kind of a tangent, more than tangentially related is, with redemption, there's also reinvention and kind of moving on. I don't know that there's too much redemption on Dark Billy Cupertine's part, but he does want to reinvent himself.
Right.
Is it fair to say that a lot of the story and almost the whole Cupertine story is kind of pivots on despair?
Yes.
I don't know how
correct.
much you can say yes and period and move on because you don't want to give anything away. But I kind of wonder, like, did you come to that later? I mean, obviously that story was written, in the last year or so, but like, how did you kind of see that developing, even years back or months back?
Yeah. So the story or the end result of Despair, what happens in the last page of Despair, is known from, the first 25 pages of Gangsterland. Like, that's in that book. So I always knew, and so it's easy for me to reveal, Dark Billy Cupertine goes off of a building and his son sees it. And it's a transformational moment for our character Sal Cupertine in his life. Without seeing that, who knows? Well, now we know what his life would have been like. But we don't know in the books what led up to Dark Billy Cupertine going off of the Sears building. And so in Despair, I tell you, I fill that in. But that scene, that story takes place in 1972 or 1973 or something like that.
73, yeah.
And that story is the pebble I drop into the water.
Right.
And from that body hitting the sidewalk comes this entire universe. Without him hitting the ground, none of this happens. And when I realized that, it made writing these stories easier. It made drawing these connections easier, because I finally understood also something larger that I was writing about. Is I'm not just creating a universe with these stories. I'm letting you know what consequence is.
Sure.
And the consequence of this action of this guy going off a building in Chicago in 1973 is also a cocktail waitress in Palm Springs whose daughter goes missing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, because that guy went off a building, this woman's daughter goes missing 30 years later.
An incredible butterfly effect for sure. Your talent comes through so brightly. It's like, okay, the last page or so of The Spare, it's beautifully written. Now
Thank you.
this is a guy, who's falling down in 6 seconds from was it the 52nd floor or some crazy thing?
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
I mean, he's gonna die. We know it's coming. His poor kids got to see it. I mean, it's absolutely, something to be abhorred, but it's also beautifully written. It's reminiscent to me of Bullet in the Brain, Tobias Wolff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. This idea of looking back at life and all those things. It's like, I don't know how, your talent comes through. It almost makes you want to cry for a
Well, thank you.
for a terrible human being. Right.
Right. Well, and that's what I'm working for, is to make you feel at the end of a story like that, like, oh my God, I should not be close to tears for these people.
Sure.
And I am. I mean, the story Ragtown has too many spoilers in it to discuss too closely, but like, that's a story that at the end, man, if you're not close to tears, I've really failed.
Yeah.
And if you're not, if you are close to tears, you're wondering to yourself, how did he make me care about these people?
Mm-hmm. Definitely care for Tanya. Tanya comes up in 2 of the stories. When she comes back in Pilgrims and has made some, you really you feel like she's got some sort of clarity at the end of the first story, which is Palm Springs. She's the cocktail waitress you're talking about. And then you're like, dang it, she hasn't learned anything, some of the terrible decisions that she made. But you talk about, like, a person tells her early in the first story, you can't think of yourself as compare and contrast. This idea of, moving on is going to help things to get better. And obviously they don't always, right? The Banality of Evil.
Mm-hmm.
I know that's almost banal to talk about that, right? But just, I love the scenes in the last story, I believe it is, where, they're in the car dealership and there are people like, okay, let me show you this car and here's your loan and here's the APR percentage. And there's also people talking about people's lives.
Right.
Like, you could be killed if you say one more thing, or don't say that to this guy.
Right.
And then of course with Sal / the rabbi, like, doing the day-to-day of a rabbi, but also, leading an organized crime family. Lastly, how about Professor?
And the thing about the Banality of Evil, 2 nights ago I was watching this documentary on Netflix about this art heist. And they had these 4 guys on a wire that were about to go rob a armored car depot, right? These 4 gangsters. And amongst these 4 gangsters, 3 of them were legit shot callers. Like, these were fucking killers. And they have them on a wire at a diner somewhere in Boston. And they're talking about this stuff, about what they're going to do and who they got to fucking kill and all this stuff. And the waitress drops off their food. And one, like, this really overweight gangster has gotten white bread. And the other gangster says to him, man, you got to give up this white bread. You got to at least eat wheat or something. This white bread is terrible for you. Like, I know you like the way it tastes, but wheat is the way you got to eat if you want to keep going. The guy's like, I can't eat that wheat bread. I don't like the seeds. They're going back and forth. And they're like, well, anyway. And then they get back to their thing. And, it's an important thing to realize, like, this is their job. And so the banality of it is how they cope with the thing that they do.
Right. Talking about coping, it's Morris again, who I believe was kind of told, like, hey, the world is, quote, a shit can. It's a nasty place. And that's a setting over most of your writing. It's just that it's an ugly world out there, and people like Morris, people like Jim, who's the Catholic who kind of wants to think everything's perfect and okay, and if not, that really goes through all of your stories. It's a dark world, and it's unfortunately pretty darn realistic, right?
Yeah, and I think the darkness of the world that I write about is scarier because it's directly adjacent to the world that you live in.
Sure.
And so, and here's a way that I think about it a lot is, so I live in a big gated community on a man-made lake and on a golf course. Okay, I live the bougiest life you can live. 1 mile from where I live, exactly 1 mile, in a one entrance and one exit cul-de-sac. So it's shaped like it's actually a U. Is the neighborhood where a huge clique of the Mexican mafia is. And between us are shops. So like there's a bunch of there's a bunch of grocery stores, CVS, the Walgreens, all that stuff. And so between the country club and the Mexican mafia,
right,
is all the stuff that we all equally need. And so you go into the grocery store and it's every dude with a full head tattoo of 13s across his face, looking, for the Woolite or whatever, and because it's their spot too, it's clean, there's no tagging, they're not robbing it. It's just clocking in, clocking out, the same place at the same time.
Right.
Their world's a lot darker than my world, but the only thing that separates us is our jobs.
Sure.
The land is the same.
Wow, what an image. I guess lastly would be, and these are definitely related, and especially the way you write about fate and faith. It's very moving in Mazel, with Kristen, who is kind of a returned Jew, returned to Judaism,
right,
after she's gotten the death sentence, basically, that she'll be dying soon of cancer. And she talks, I think maybe even twice in the story, about fighting them in the streets, whether that was literally the Nazis, whether that was, the people that she worked against in the FBI, rather than them finding you in the basement. It's obviously such a historical, connection there. But just about her faith or lack thereof, and unfortunately the rabbi that she goes to seek redemption from or help from is Rabbi David Cohen. But then, faith as well, Jim seems to have a true faith. There's the idea of the butterfly effect and again, fate, like if this wouldn't have happened, then this one, the whole domino effect. I wonder what you were kind of, working with fate and faith and how those came into play.
Well, I think a lot about these things because of my somewhat extensive reading into the Jewish faith, which has, a magical element to it, like this idea of Mazel has sort of a magical thing, but also the notion of doing mitzvahs for people, a good thing, a gift, that then those things will return to you. And, I don't, and, that's no different than karma or, these are all the same myths.
Sure.
Spread out through every single religion, right?
Sure.
But, I'm interested in the notion that we often believe in those things when we really need them. Like we put our faith in magic when we're sick or we're dying or when nothing else makes sense. When we need to find order to chaos, we see a bird fly by and that tells us, we're going to be fine. Because I'm not a religious person, but I suspect I'm probably a spiritual person. And so I'm not beyond magical thinking. And I said this in a book, but it's the truth about my own life, which is that I didn't believe in an afterlife until I fell in love. And
wow,
that's the nature of being a human being. Is, well, once you have that person that you can't imagine not existing with, well, then of course there has to be something beyond this life that we have. And Jews don't really believe in an afterlife. Different sects of Jews don't. There's this idea that the Messiah comes back and all Jews roll to Israel through a series of underground caves and are reborn through the dew of resurrection. That sounds fucking horrible. Like, I don't need to roll to Israel. I don't even want to go to Israel. Like, roll me to a chart house. I don't want to go to Israel. But all that stuff is just, I think, part of being a person in the middle of a tense situation. Just like what do you put your faith in when the world seems to be collapsing around you? And to be clear, for instance, in the last, say, 4 years up through about January 20th of this year, but then also this entire last year when we've been in the middle of a plague.
What a coincidental date, huh?
Yeah, this time that we've been living in a plague, also, like, man, I'm looking for signs that I'm going to get out of this thing. I'm looking for signs that that there's someone good in the world, but I'm looking for an anti-hero to go and clean up the whole fucking mess. You know, I want someone who's just gonna be like, hey, you know what? Here's what's gonna happen. I'm gonna kill everyone, and it's gonna be fine. Like, I sort of want that Red Harvest guy to show up. I want the Continental Op to show up.
Right.
But all of that's magic, right? All of that it's wanting Superman.
Yes.
You know, it's really wanting Superman. But I want Superman who's more of a badass. And so this notion, I think, comes into the stories that I write about because of these ideas of pipe dreams and faith and fate. Like, this was bound to happen. This was going to happen. Nothing is a coincidence. All of those things. And those are just, these are things that I'm obsessed by. Right. And so they end up showing up in my sad little crime stories.
Very interesting. I'm reminded of Hemingway had these little pieces. I don't even know what you would call them. They're like literally a paragraph, like in his collected short stories. And one of them, there's a soldier in a trench in World War I, and he thinks he's going to die. He's being shelled. And all of a sudden it's, please God, save me. Please God, save me. If you do, I'll do this, I'll do that. And it says basically the shelling stops, and he never told anyone about that again, the kind of thing. Right. And he never did do those things for God.
Right.
What you're talking about, just like when we need it, when we need him or God. That's very interesting. I did lie. There's the last maybe theme would be death, which, you talked about with the afterlife and such. There's such an interesting, like almost like No Country for Old Men, that last scene where Tommy Lee Jones is just kind of like ruining his age, with Morris, and just the idea of aging and dementia for one of the characters, the world passing people by. You're a young man. Why so much about aging and dementia and becoming decrepit? I don't know where that came from.
Well, I live in God's waiting room. I live in the Coachella Valley, where the industry is hospitals and golf courses.
Yes.
I'm also deeply obsessed with my own mortality and mental health towards the end of my life. So I just turned 50 in January, and now every time something feels weird in my body, or I can't find my keys, I'm like, oh my God, is it Alzheimer's? What is it? I'm looking at my 23andMe to see if they've updated it. Like, oh no, you're screwed. Whatever it might be. But the character of Morris Drew is an interesting one, because in fact, that story, the second story in the book, so there's 3 stories. There's the Low Desert, there's the Last Good Man, and there's the Salt. And so you see Morris Drew at age 30, at age 60, and at age almost 80, late 70s. The first story I ever wrote about Morris Drew was The Last Good Man.
Okay.
And I wrote that story in 1996.
Whoa.
When I was 25 years old.
Yes.
And that was the story that was in my head about him, was this old man going through this thing and thinking about this old case. I've rewritten that story, I don't know, 5 times and published 5 different versions of it. So you can find a version of that story if you go to a library in Indianapolis and find a men's magazine that published it in 1996.
Okay, yeah.
You can find a version of it in my collection, Other Resort Cities. You can find a version of it in the Soho Books anthology, The Usual Santas. In that book, it's called Blue Memories Start Calling. And you can find it in this. And I have rewritten it over and over and over again so that it lines up with the other stories that I'm writing about Morris Drew. So it lines up with The Salt. It lines up with Morris Drew, who's actually a character in Living Dead Girl, my second novel. I sometimes forget that he's in that. And then I rewrote it again so it lines up with the facts of the Low Desert also. But I've always been obsessed with this guy, this lawman at the end of a career, where in the background, he's got all this horrible shit that he did.
Yes.
And how he reckons with that. But the stuff that I wrote, or the stuff that's new in that story about him questioning all those things, I couldn't have written that when I was 25 years old. Right. I didn't have enough regrets. I hadn't paid enough taxes. That was all new. I mean, there's thousands of new words in The Last Good Man. And a lot of it is him being haunted by one of his dead wives, essentially, as he drives through town, but also haunted by the man that he used to be and the man that he wants to be. All of that, I didn't know anything at 25 years old. No one knows anything at 25 years old,
Exactly.
which makes it curious. And I'm screaming at a television watching whatever sport I'm watching, where I'm screaming at a 25-year-old, how dare you? You fucked it up.
Yeah.
Throw to the open man, hit the open runner, hit the 3-point shot. I'm like, oh, I'm screaming at a 25-year-old. What did I know at 25? And this guy has all my t-shirts. So, these notions that I write about and about old age, I cared about them when I was young. But I couldn't really write about them until I was older.
Thank you for that. It's so interesting to see the development of stories and characters throughout the years. And again, Morris is a great example of that, not just in the books, but in the author's mind. That's really cool. As you got older, as you knew more about life. I wonder if you have time, if you might want to read a bit of your work from the Low Desert.
Sure. Why don't I read? And listeners, this was pre-planned. I can't go forward with this lie. Why don't I read a little bit from the ending of Palm Springs? Because in fact, what the end of the story does is it actually is kind of the thesis statement for this entire book, as it turns out. So I'm just going to read the last page and a half here. If you're at home, it starts on page 73. So Tanya is a cocktail waitress at a Indian casino in Palm Springs, and her daughter has disappeared. She adopted a young woman from an orphanage in Russia. This is before the Magnitsky Act. She adopted a young woman from an orphanage in Russia, and after about I think it's 5 years that she's with her daughter disappears, and she presumes that her daughter has run away. And so the story is essentially a story about coming to grips with her future, and it all happens over the course of one day. It starts with her going to work and ends with her going out on a date with a coworker named Gordon, who's a bartender at the Indian casino. Tanya stares out her sliding glass door as Gordon's taillights disappear down the hill, back toward Palm Springs. It's midnight, and though the air has chilled, Tanya feels feverish. She told Gordon, as he pulled up to her complex, that she'd invite him in, but was afraid she'd caught a bug sitting outside for so long this evening. She shakes her head thinking about it, how silly she must have sounded, as if she could catch consumption from sitting outside listening to Jimmy Buffett songs on a spring night. It's okay, he said. And Tanya sensed solace from Gordon, though the truth is that she's forgotten how to read young men. They used to be so obvious to her, but now they're just mannerisms in her peripheral. There'll be other nights. I know where you work. She kissed him lightly on the cheek and got out of his car, didn't bother to turn and smile or even give a little wave when she got to the top step of the metal staircase that leads to her apartment, though she knew Gordon was watching her. He'd been raised well enough to wait until a woman was inside her home before driving off, but not well enough to be doing something better with his life than bartending at an Indian casino. And that alone made Tanya sad for him. She opens the sliding door and steps outside onto her tiny patio. She's arranged 3 pots of daisies around a single white plastic chair. And though it doesn't seem like much, it's all she can do to keep those daisies alive. She stands against the wrought iron railing surrounding the patio and stares south toward the wind farms of Palm Springs. Watches as light jumps between the spinning windmill turbines. Listens for the low whine of the coyotes that often rummage in the dumpsters behind her building, and who she sees lazing in the shadows on the hottest desert mornings. She knows she gave up too much tonight, that things will be awkward with Gordon from now on, but that's okay. Nothing's permanent anymore. There's nothing that says this life has to be lived waiting for the next shame. Natalia is not coming back, Tanya says aloud. And then she says it again and again and again until her words have lost all shape in her ears, until she feels something rise up inside of her, a sense of confidence, of lucidity that she can't recall ever possessing. She sits down in the white plastic chair and realizes what she's feeling after so long, after all these years, is relief. I did that woman wrong. I did that woman wrong.
Oh man, you just realize that, right? Like, dang it, can I go back and change it?
No, I've known for a while that I've done her wrong. Someone today tweeted to me that they had just finished the book and that they were feeling heartbroken, and I knew why. And I said, I'm sorry for what I did to Tanya and to her life.
Yes.
And they're like, how could you do it?
Well, thank you so much for reading that. I mean, it's so cool to hear the author himself read it. The pathos is definitely built in there. This image of her saying that out loud to herself, repeating it to herself, is pretty moving. You have so many compelling characters in this short story collection. So many. She could get her own spin-off, so and so. What are your future projects? I know they often say that Hollywood is a fickle mistress or something to that effect. But with the screenplays or with your future books, what are you working on?
Well, right now I'm in fact working on the TV show version of Gangsterland, of which some of these stories are related.
Sure.
So we've got a good team working on that. So that's been a fruitful experience. I have to write the third and concluding book in the Gangsterland trilogy. I have to do that. I also really want to write about Morris Drew, the Salton Sea, in the 1960s, staring out over this wrecked, fetid body of water at the golden hour with a dead body at his feet. I really want to write about that.
Wow, the golden hour. Okay. The episode won't air until a little bit after, but are you, in the short term, are you going to be either watching or taking part in the LA Times Book Festival?
I will be. I'll be doing a panel on the 17th of April. I think it's 17th. Well, this will be afterwards. It's the Monday. Maybe that's the 19th, with Christopher Bolin and Jennifer Hillier and Paula L. Woods.
Nice.
And I think they'll have the videos available after that. I'm looking forward to it. Christopher and Jennifer are both up for the LA Times Book Prize. So they'll have 3 people that have been up for the LA Times Book Prize on the same panel. It'll be cool. And the whole lineup actually is quite cool, and I'm hoping to catch some of my friends. This is the sad part of all of this is right now my Facebook memories are all just photos from the LA Times Festival books for the last 20 years
that
just show up. This is the time of year when I leave the Coachella Valley, because it's Coachella right now, and I go to LA for the book festival, and I come back and I mock the people walking around with angel wings, and I act all literary when I see them, because they don't know that what they've missed in LA while they've been gone. Sure. I'm yearning for us to be back in person to do these kinds of events. I miss them desperately. But the thing I really miss, though, is just going out there and seeing my friends. To be honest, the writing community in Southern California, everybody knows each other. And people are always surprised about who's friends with who and all that sort of thing. And you can't talk shit about anyone because we all know one another. So I'm looking forward to being in the green room in 2022 of the LA Times Festival of Books, eating weird little sandwiches and hugging America's literary elite.
Yes. I mean, is there literally a better weekend than the LA Times Book Festival?
No, there's not.
Right? No, period. Again, a pleasure. I know you're a busy man, and thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for reading, and thanks so much for talking about some of your creative genius. Really appreciate it.
Happy to do it. It's a good time.
And great luck to you, and the best of luck in the future for sure.
Thanks.
What a pleasure it's been to speak with Tod Goldberg on episode 59. You can now subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and leave me a 5-star review for the Chills at Will podcast. You can also ask for it by name using Alexa and find it on Stitcher, Spotify, and Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter where I'm Chills at Will PO1. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation, and I'd love for your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look at an often ignored art form. The intro song for the Chills at Will podcast is Wind Down instrumental version, and the other great song played on the episode was Hoops instrumental by Matt Whitehour. Both songs are used through archesaudio.com. For now, thanks again for listening, and I hope that these quarantine days bring you texts like Gangsterland, like The Low Desert, by writers with mad skills like Tod Goldberg, whose work gives you chills at will.